Someone want to tell me why 3 grown men with trade certifications cannot figure out how to mount a road wheel on a tank that has been sitting in museums since before any of you were born? Derek Schofield's voice cut through the frozen air of the shop like a blade, his breath visible in white puffs despite the space heaters working overtime in every corner. The M48 Patton sat in the center bay like a sleeping giant, 60 tons of olive drab steel in American history, its fresh paint gleaming under the fluorescent lights while its guts remained stubbornly incomplete. For days, that was all Derek had. 4 days until the Veterans Day Parade. 4 days until the collector who had paid half up front would either write the second check or demand his deposit back with interest and lawyers. 4 days to save the shop his father had built and the reputation Derek had inherited along with the debt. Mitch Colby, the lead mechanic, straightened up from where he had been crouched beside the tank's road wheel assembly, his face flushed with frustration and cold. "The manual says to release the bolts in sequence," he said, wiping grease-blackened hands on a rag that only spread the stains around. "I am releasing them in sequence. The assembly keeps binding." "Then you're doing something wrong," Derek snapped. "Figure it out." The door at the front of the shop creaked open, and everyone turned toward the sound. A gust of frozen December wind swept through the bay, carrying with it a figure that seemed assembled from winter itself. The man was old, 70 at least, his face weathered into deep creases that spoke of decades spent squinting against sun and sand and things most people never had to see. He wore a torn army field jacket over layers of donated clothing, each piece mismatched and faded, the whole ensemble held together more by habit than by thread. His hands, visible where they emerged from sleeves too short for his arms, trembled with the cold. "Sorry," the old man said, and his voice came out hoarse, rough from disuse. "Just looking to warm up for a few minutes if that is all right. Hands do not work so well when it gets like this." Derek was already moving toward him, irritation replacing the frustration he had been directing at his mechanics. "This is not a shelter," he said. "We are running a business here." The old man did not argue, did not plead, simply nodded once, a small gesture of acceptance that suggested he had heard those words 1,000 times before and expected to hear them 1,000 times again. But he did not immediately turn to leave. Instead, his eyes found the space heater glowing in the corner near the tool bench, and something that might have been hope flickered briefly across his features. "Just a few minutes," he said again. "Then I will be on my way." If you are watching this story from anywhere in the world tonight, from cities where shops just like this one, to the industrial districts, from towns where the cold drives people to seek warmth wherever they can find it, we would love to know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment below and tell us your city or country. And if stories like this one, stories about courage and hidden worth and second chances, speak to something in you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more of these incredible, true stories that honor the quiet heroes among us. Now, let us continue. Derek hesitated. The old man was not asking for money, was not asking for food, just warmth. And despite everything, despite the pressure and the deadline and the broken tank that might break his business, Derek was not cruel. "Go on then," he said finally, jerking his head toward the corner. "Few minutes." The old man moved toward the heater with a shuffling gait that spoke of miles walked on pavement never meant for sleeping. But something about the way he positioned himself caught the attention of Vern Tedesco, the oldest mechanic in the shop, who had been watching from beneath a pickup truck he was servicing. The old man put his back to the wall. His eyes swept the shop once, automatically, cataloging exits and occupants and sightlines. Then he settled into stillness with the patience of someone who had learned to wait in places far more dangerous than this. Vern frowned and returned to his work, but he kept finding his gaze drawn back to the corner. Mitch had returned to the road wheel assembly, determined to prove his competence. He released the first bolt, then the second. The assembly groaned, metal grinding against metal in a sound that made every mechanic in the shop wince. He tried forcing it. The grinding intensified. Derek ran a hand through his hair, calculating costs he could not afford. If Mitch damaged the original parts, if they had to source replacements for a tank that had not been in production for half a century, The parade would come and go, and the shop would follow it into memory. The old man's hands had stopped shaking. He was watching the tank now, watching Mitch struggle with the assembly, and something had changed in his posture. Subtle, almost invisible. But if anyone had been looking closely, they would have seen his shoulders square slightly, his chin lift a fraction of an inch. His eyes, which had been dull with cold and exhaustion, had sharpened into focus. He knew what was wrong, knew it the way he knew his own heartbeat. The tensioning system on this particular model had a quirk, a factory defect addressed in a field manual update in 1969 that had never made it into civilian restoration guides. You had to release pressure in a specific sequence, or the whole assembly would bind exactly the way Mitch was experiencing. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. Not his place. Not anymore. He was nobody now, just an old man with shaking hands and nowhere to sleep, and 3 names tattooed on his wrist that reminded him every day why he did not deserve warmth or help or the right to speak up in rooms where real people were doing real work. In exactly 40 minutes, everything in this shop would change. The men who dismissed him would stand in silence. The work they could not complete would yield to hands they had mocked. And a legend that the armor community had mourned as lost would step back into the light he had been hiding from for 30 years. But for now, Clement Washburn simply pulled his hands closer to the heater and watched the young men fail at something he could have fixed with his eyes closed. The smell of diesel and metal polish wrapped around Clement like a blanket made of memory. And for a moment, he was not in a freezing repair shop in the Midwest, but somewhere else entirely. Somewhere hot. Somewhere where the air tasted of sand and burning oil and the particular electricity that precedes violence. Kuwait, February 1991, the night before everything changed. He was younger then, 40 years old and built like the machines he commanded, shoulders broad enough to fill the cramped confines of an M1 Abrams turret. Master Sergeant Clement Washburn, call sign Iron Horse, tank commander with the 3rd Armored Division. Spearhead, the tip of the spear that was about to punch through the heart of Saddam Hussein's Republican Guard. His crew surrounded him in the darkness of the tank's interior, their faces lit by the green glow of instrument panels. Specialist Terrence Pike, the loader, was telling a joke he had told 6 times already, something about a general and a camel that was not funny the first time and had not improved with repetition. But the boys laughed anyway because laughing was better than thinking about what tomorrow would bring. Corporal Donovan Oakes sat in the gunner's seat, running his hands over the breech mechanism for what must have been the 15th time that hour. Oakes was meticulous to the point of obsession, the kind of soldier who checked everything twice and then checked it again, because what if he missed something the first 2 times? Clement had never served with a better gunner. And in the driver's compartment, barely visible through the hatch, PFC William Suarez hummed something under his breath. Church music. Suarez was always humming church music. Said it kept him calm. Said his grandmother told him the saints would protect him if he kept them close. Clement hoped she was right. Get some sleep, Clement told them. Tomorrow we push through to the ridge. Medina Division is dug in and waiting for us. It is going to be the real thing. Pike's joke died in his throat. Oak stopped checking the breech. Even Suarez's humming faded into silence. The Medina Division. Iraq's finest armor. T-72 tanks crewed by men who had been fighting for a decade, first against Iran and now against the world. The intelligence briefings had been clear. This would be the largest tank engagement since World War II. Some of them would not survive it. Clement looked at each of his boys in turn. Pike with his nervous jokes and his picture of a girl back home he had never actually asked out. Oakes with his obsessive checking and his quiet competence. Suarez with his hymns and his grandmother's saints. They trusted him, completely, without reservation. They would follow his orders into hell itself, because that was what soldiers did, and because Clement had never given them reason to doubt. He should have doubted himself. The clang of metal on metal yanked Clement back to the present. Mitch had dropped a wrench, the sound echoing through the shop like a gunshot. Clement's hand moved instinctively toward his hip, reaching for a sidearm that had not been there in 30 years, and he forced himself to stillness before anyone could notice. The shopper formed around him. Cold concrete floor. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The M48 Patton squatting in the center bay like a ghost from another era. Not his tank. Not even the same model. But close enough that looking at it hurt in ways he could not explain to anyone who had not sat in a commander's hatch and watched the world burn. Mitch was cursing now, a steady stream of frustration directed at the road wheel assembly that refused to cooperate. The other mechanics offered suggestions that went nowhere. Derek paced behind them, checking his phone, calculating losses, radiating anxiety that filled the shop like a physical presence. And Clement watched Mitch release the bolts in the wrong order again, watched the assembly bind again, watched the mounting frustration that would eventually lead to damaged parts and missed deadlines and a business that would not survive the winter. He knew exactly what they were doing wrong and exactly how to fix it. The knowledge sat in his hands like muscle memory, decades of experience that no amount of homelessness or heartbreak could erase. Release the third retaining bolt before the second. Simple, obvious to anyone who had spent years maintaining armored vehicles in conditions where stuck assembly could mean death. But what right did he have to speak? What right did a man who got his crew killed have to offer advice to anyone? Pike and Oakes and Suarez were in the ground because of him, because of orders he gave, because of a position he put them in. Their faces visited him every night, asking why. Why did you survive when we did not? Why are you still breathing when we're dust? He had never found an answer. So he had stopped looking, stopped trying, started walking, and never stopped until he found himself here, in a frozen shop, watching strangers struggle with a problem he could solve in his sleep. The heater hummed beside him, pushing warmth against his hands that barely penetrated the cold that had settled into his bones years ago. Outside, the wind howled against the walls like something trying to get in. Or maybe like something trying to remind him that he did not belong in places with heat and light and people doing honest work. Derek's voice cut through his thoughts. His tolerance had reached its limit. The shop owner crossed the floor with purpose in his stride, stopping directly in front of Clement with arms folded across his chest. "Look," Derek said, and the word carried the weight of a man at the end of his patience. "I'll let you warm up. You have been sitting there for 20 minutes. But this is not a waiting room, and I have got a crisis on my hands. Is there something else you need, or can I get back to figuring out how to save my business?" Clement shook his head slowly. "No, sir," he said. "Nothing else. I appreciate the warmth." He began to rise, joints protesting the movement, preparing to return to the frozen streets and the long walk to wherever he would sleep tonight. The cold would be brutal. His hands would ache for hours. But that was fine. That was what he deserved. Then Mitch swore again, louder this time, and something in the sound broke through Clement's carefully constructed walls. The words came out before he could stop them. Soft, almost apologetic, but clear enough to carry across the shop. "You need to release the third retaining bolt before the second. Otherwise, the tension plate shifts and the whole assembly binds." Every head in the shop turned toward the corner where an old homeless man had just told professional mechanics how to do their job. The silence that followed Clement's words stretched across the shop like a hell breath. Mitch straightened up slowly from his crouch beside the tank, wrench still in hand, his face cycling through confusion and disbelief before settling on something harder. Something offended. "Excuse me," Mitch said, and the words came out sharp enough to cut. "Did you just try to tell me how to fix a tank?" Clement was already retreating, physically and emotionally, shrinking back toward the corner as if he could disappear into the shadows. "I apologize," he said. "Should not have said anything. My mistake." But Mitch was not finished. He stepped away from the Patton, closing the distance between himself and the old man with the deliberate stride of someone who had been embarrassed in front of his co-workers and needed to reclaim his dignity. 2 years of trade school certification hung on the wall behind the front counter. 2 years of learning how to do this job from people who actually knew what they were talking about. And now some vagrant was going to waltz in off the street and critique his technique. "Let me guess," Mitch said, his voice rising so the other mechanics could hear. "You're some kind of tank expert. Spent your whole career working on armor. Probably a general, right?" That is usually how these stories go. Laughter rippled through the shop. Nervous laughter, the kind that happens when people are not sure if they should be laughing, but do it anyway, because someone else started. Derek watched from near the front counter, arms still folded, making no move to intervene. Clement shook his head. Just read it somewhere once, he said. That is all. I'll go now. He moved toward the door, pulling his field jacket tighter around his thin frame, already bracing for the cold that waited outside. But Mitch was not done. The younger man stepped into his path, not quite blocking him, but close enough to make the message clear. Maybe spend less time pretending you know about tanks, Mitch said, and more time finding a shelter. There's one on 5th Street. They take people like you. People like you. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Homeless. Worthless. The kind of person whose opinions did not matter because their circumstances had rendered them invisible. Clement did not respond, did not defend himself, simply waited for Mitch to move, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the younger man's shoulder, seeing nothing and everything at once. From across the shop, Vern Tedesco watched the exchange with growing unease. He had slid out from beneath the pickup truck and now stood wiping his hands on a rag, his attention fixed on the old man's posture. Something was wrong. Not wrong in the sense of dangerous, but wrong in the sense of misaligned. The way the old man held himself did not match the clothes he was wearing or the shuffling gait he had entered with. There was something underneath, something trained. Vern had served in the Army himself, back in the late 80s. Never saw combat. Spent most of his enlistment maintaining vehicles at bases in Germany while the Cold War wound down around him. But he had known men who had seen the real thing, had watched how they carried themselves, how they moved, how they could go from relaxed to ready in the space between heartbeats. This old man moved like that. Or rather, he was trying very hard not to move like that. Derek's patience finally shattered. All right, he said, pushing off from the counter and crossing toward Clement. That is enough. You need to leave. Now, I've got 4 days to get this tank running, and I do not have time for distractions. If you're not gone in 30 seconds, I'm calling the police. The word police landed like a physical blow. Clement flinched, almost imperceptibly, and something flickered across his face. Not fear, something older, something that looked almost like acceptance. Yes, sir, Clement said. I understand. He stepped around Mitch and moved toward the door. His hand was on the handle when it swung open from the outside, bringing with it another gust of frozen air and a woman in a professional wool coat who clearly had not expected to find a confrontation in progress. Colleen Fraser stopped just inside the threshold, taking in the scene with quick, assessing eyes. She was 42, sharp-featured, with the bearing of someone accustomed to military environments. Her client, the collector who owned the patent, had sent her to check on progress. What she found instead was a shabby old man being ushered out by a young mechanic whose body language radiated hostility. What is going on here? She asked. Derek moved to intercept her, his tone shifting immediately to something more professional. Nothing, he said. Just a vagrant we are removing. Ms. Fraser, I was not expecting you until tomorrow. But Colleen was not looking at Derek. She was looking at the old man who had stopped with his hand still on the door, and something about him had captured her attention. The way he stood, the way his eyes had automatically cataloged her presence, assessed her as non-threatening, and filed the information away in less than a second. She had served with men who did that. During her time as a logistics officer in the initial invasion of Iraq, she had worked alongside special operations units whose members carried themselves with exactly the kind of unconscious vigilance. Are you all right? She asked Clement directly. The old man blinked, surprised to be addressed as a person rather than a problem. Yes, ma'am, he said. Just fine. Just leaving. Mom. The word came out automatically, reflexively, the way it only did for people who had spent years in environments where such courtesies were drilled into muscle memory. Colleen turned to Derek. It's freezing outside, she said. Can he stay a few more minutes? Warm up before he goes. Derek opened his mouth to protest, then remembered who was writing the checks that would save his business. He exhaled sharply. Fine, he said. Few more minutes. Then he goes. Clement hesitated at the door, uncertain. Colleen gestured toward the space heater. Go on, she said. I am not in any hurry. He returned to his corner slowly, like a man who had learned not to trust kindness because it so often came with conditions. But as he settled back in his spot near the heater, his sleeve rode up slightly, exposing his wrist. Colleen saw it. Just a glimpse, just for a moment, before he tugged his sleeve back down. But it was enough. Ink. Old ink. Faded by decades, but still visible. The edge of something circular. And beneath it, letters she could not quite make out. She said nothing, but she kept watching. And she began to wonder what kind of man hid beneath those tattered layers of donated clothing. Colleen positioned herself where she could watch both the work on the tank and the old man in the corner. Derek hovered nearby, clearly uncomfortable with her presence during what he considered an embarrassing situation, but unwilling to challenge the representative of the client who held his financial future in her hands. "The patent," she said, nodding toward the massive vehicle. "Beautiful restoration work on the exterior. How is a mechanical progress coming?" Derek's jaw tightened. "We have hit a snag with the road wheel assembly," he admitted, "but we will have it sorted. Plenty of time before the parade." Colleen did not look convinced, but she let it pass. She had seen enough military equipment in various states of repair to recognize when someone was struggling. The question was whether they would struggle their way to success or failure. Mitch had returned to the assembly with renewed determination, his pride demanding that he solve this problem without any help from homeless men who claimed to have read things somewhere once. He positioned the bolts, released the first one, then the second. The assembly bound again. Metal screamed against metal, a sound that made everyone in the shop wince. Mitch slammed his palm against the tank's hull in frustration, the impact echoing through the bay like a drum. Derek ran both hands through his hair, a gesture of mounting desperation. "That assembly binds one more time, and we're going to crack something," he said. "And if we crack something, we are not making the parade. And if we do not make the parade, I am finished." Vern spoke up from his position near the pickup truck. "Maybe try what the old-timer said." Mitch spun around, his face flushed. "You cannot be serious." "What is the harm?" Vern said. "We have tried everything else." "Release the third bolt before the second. Worst case, it binds again, and we are right where we started." Mitch looked to Derek for support, but the shop owner was staring at the tank with the expression of a man calculating odds he did not like. "We are running out of options," Derek said finally. "Just try it." The words came out like they cost him something. Mitch's expression made clear he felt similarly about following advice from a vagrant. But he turned back to the assembly, positioned his wrench on the third retaining bolt, and released it first. Then the second bolt. The assembly slid into place with a smooth, almost musical precision. No grinding, no binding. Just the clean mechanical motion of parts doing exactly what they were designed to do. The shop went silent. Mitch stared at the assembly like it had personally betrayed him. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Lucky guess," he said finally. "Gotta be." Derek was not listening. He was looking at the old man in the corner, at the hunched figure who had just solved in 5 seconds a problem that his certified mechanics had been fighting for hours. "Lucky guess," Derek repeated, but his tone made the words a question rather than a statement. Clement kept his eyes on the space heater, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. "Just something I read once," he said again. "Nothing more than that." But Colleen was already moving closer to him, her curiosity overriding her professional detachment. She stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak quietly, far enough to respect his obvious desire for distance. "Where did you read it?" she asked. Clement's hands tightened slightly in his lap. "Old manual," he said. "Long time ago. Must have been a very specific manual. That is not common knowledge. I served in Iraq during the initial push in 2003. Worked logistics for units that operated everything from Humvees to Abrams. Never heard of that particular quirk." The mention of Iraq made something shift behind Clement's eyes, a shadow passing across water. He said nothing. Colleen pressed gently. "What branch did you serve in?" The question hung in the air. Derek and Mitch had both turned to watch the exchange now, their earlier hostility replaced by something more complicated. Vern had stopped, even pretending to work on the pickup truck. Clement was silent for a long moment. Then, so quietly that Colleen had to lean closer to hear, he said 2 words. 3rd Armored. Colleen's eyebrows rose. Spearhead Division, she said. Desert Storm. A single nod from Clement, barely perceptible. Mitch let out a sharp laugh from across the shop. Of course, he said. 3rd Armored Division. One of the most famous units in the entire army. Why not claim you won the war single-handed while you are at it? Next you will tell us you were at Medina Ridge. The name landed like a grenade. Medina Ridge. The largest tank battle since World War II. The engagement that broke the back of Iraq's Republican Guard and ended the ground war in 100 hours. Every armor soldier knew about Medina Ridge. Every tank commander studied it. Clement said nothing, but his hands had begun to tremble again, and this time it was not from a cold. Vern pushed off from the truck and walked slowly across the shop floor. His eyes were fixed on Clement's wrists, on the sleeves that had ridden up just enough to show the edges of old ink beneath the grime and weathering. "What was your MOS?" Vern asked. His voice had changed, grown serious in a way that made the other mechanics fall silent. The military occupational specialty. The job code that defined what a soldier did. Clement looked up at him, and for just a moment the mask slipped. Behind the exhaustion and the grief and the decades of self-imposed exile, something else emerged. Something harder. Something forged in fire and blood and sand. 19 kilo, Clement said. Tank crewman. Then master gunner. Vern stopped walking. His face had gone pale. "You do not fake master gunner," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That is not something you just claim. The certification alone takes years." His eyes dropped to Clement's wrist, to where the sleeve had slipped further. Tank treads in a circle, coordinates beneath them, and 2 words in Gothic script that Vern could almost read. "Roll up your sleeve," Vern said. "Please, I need to see." Clement looked at Vern for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. The request hung between them, simple and impossible at the same time. "Roll up your sleeve. Show us who you are. Prove that you are not what we assumed." But proof meant exposure. Exposure meant questions. Questions meant reliving things that Clement had spent 30 years trying to bury beneath layers of silence and distance, and the slow erosion of self that came from sleeping under bridges and eating from soup kitchens and becoming invisible to a world that had once saluted him. Derek stepped forward, his earlier hostility curdling into something more suspicious. "Hold on," he said. "Before we go any further, I want to know what is happening here. This man walks into my shop, gives one piece of advice that happens to work, and suddenly we are supposed to believe he is some kind of war hero." He turned to face Clement directly, arms crossed over his chest. "I have seen this before," Derek continued. "Guys who hang around military surplus stores, pick up enough terminology to sound convincing, then use it to guilt people into giving them money. Stolen valor. That is what they call it, right?" The words hit Clement like a physical blow. Stolen valor. The accusation that every legitimate veteran dreaded. The suggestion that your service, your sacrifice, your scars, both visible and invisible, were nothing more than a costume you put on to manipulate others. He should have been angry, should have defended himself, should have stood up and demanded respect for the things he had done and the brothers he had lost. But anger required energy that Clement had exhausted years ago. Defense required believing you deserved to be defended. And Clement had stopped believing that the night he pulled himself from a burning tank and left 3 men behind. "I'm not asking for anything," Clement said quietly. "I will go." He started to rise, but Vern moved to block his path. Not physically aggressive, just present. A barrier made of curiosity and something that might have been recognition. "3rd Armored Division," Vern said. "Spearhead. You said you were there during Desert Storm." Clement nodded once, a small motion that cost him more than anyone watching could understand. Vern continued. "I serve in the Army myself. Late 80s, early 90s. Never saw combat. Spent most of my time turning wrenches at bases in Germany. But I knew men who went to the Gulf. Knew men who came back different. And I spent enough time at Fort Knox after I got out to hear the stories they taught at the armor school." He paused, his eyes searching Clement's face for something. Confirmation. Denial. Anything. "There was a tank commander," Vern said slowly. Call sign Iron Horse. Medina Ridge, February 1991. His tank took a direct hit from a T-72 during a night engagement. Killed 3 of his crew. But before the tank cooked off, this commander, wounded and half blind from the fire, manually operated the main gun, knocked out 3 enemy tanks, repositioned his burning vehicle to shield a damaged command track, called in coordinates for air support while his own ammunition was cooking off around him. The shop had gone completely silent. Even the wind outside seemed to pause, as if the building itself was holding its breath. They pulled him out minutes before the whole thing exploded, Vern continued. Silver Star, Purple Heart, every commendation the Army could give. They studied that engagement at Knox for years. Textbook example of valor under impossible conditions. Mitch shifted uncomfortably near the tank. His earlier mockery had drained from his face, replaced by uncertainty. "Come on," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You are not seriously suggesting this guy is some kind of legend?" Derek said nothing. His arms had uncrossed, his posture shifting from accusation to something more guarded. Colleen had her phone in her hand now, not recording, just holding it. Ready. Her logistics background meant she had access to networks of veterans, researchers, historians who specialized in exactly these kinds of stories. One call, and she could verify or disprove everything. Vern took another step toward Clement. "The commander's name was Washburn," he said. "First name Clement. Call sign Iron Horse. After the war, he just disappeared. Left the service. Dropped off the map. The armor community spent years wondering what happened to him. Some said he died. Some said he went somewhere to heal. He stopped directly in front of the old man, close enough to see the tremor in those weathered hands, close enough to see the way Clement's jaw had tightened against something rising from deep inside. Some said the guilt of losing his crew ate him alive. Vern finished quietly, that he could not forgive himself for surviving when they did not. Clement closed his eyes. The shop, the cold, the watching faces all faded away, replaced by the darkness behind his eyelids where 3 young men waited for him every night. Pike with his jokes, Oakes with his obsessive checking, Suarez with his hymns. They had trusted him, followed him, died because of decisions he made in fractions of seconds that played out over decades of consequence. When Clement opened his eyes again, something had changed. The mask he wore, the shuffling invisible homeless man, had cracked just enough to let something else show through. Something older. Something forged in the burning hull of an M1 Abrams on a night when the desert ran red with fire and blood. "They were right," Clement said, and his voice had dropped to barely a whisper. "About the last part. They were right about that." Vern's breath caught in his throat. The other mechanics stood frozen, statues in a tableau of revelation. Then Vern spoke again, and his voice cracked on the words. "Roll up your sleeve," he said. "Please. I need to see." This time, Clement did not refuse. With hands that trembled from more than cold, he reached for his left sleeve and began to push the worn fabric up his forearm. The fabric moved slowly up Clement's forearm, revealing skin weathered by decades of exposure and neglect. First came the scars, burn marks that traced jagged lines across his flesh like rivers on a map, the kind of scars that come from fire hot enough to melt steel. Then, emerging from beneath the grime and the years, the ink began to show. Tank treads formed a circle around his wrist, each link rendered in precise detail that had faded but never disappeared. Inside the circle, coordinates emerged. 30.0444N, 47.8194E. Numbers that meant nothing to most people, but everything to anyone who had studied the Gulf War. The exact location of the Medina Ridge engagement. Below the coordinates, in Gothic script that had been applied by a steadier hand than Clement's now possessed, 2 words, Iron Horse. And beneath that, 3 sets of initials, TP, DO, WS Terrence Pike, Donovan Oakes, William Suarez, his crew, his boys, permanently inked into his skin so he could never forget them, never escape them, never pretend they had not existed and trusted him and died. Vern made a sound that was not quite a word. His hand came up to cover his mouth, And when he lowered it again, his eyes were wet. "Iron Horse," he said, and the name came out broken. "My God, it is really you." The shop remained frozen. Mitch had backed away from the tank, his earlier bravado completely gone, replaced by something that looked like shame. Derek stood motionless, his accusations of stolen valor dissolving in the face of evidence that could not be faked. Colleen had raised her phone, recording now, her journalistic instincts recognizing that she was witnessing something that would matter beyond this moment. Clement said nothing. He simply stood there with his sleeve rolled up, the history of his worst night exposed for strangers to examine. The trembling in his hands had spread to his entire body, a fine vibration that came from somewhere deeper than muscle and bone. Vern stepped closer, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. "We studied you," he said, "at Knox, at Benning. Every armor officer, every tank commander who came through training after 1991 learned about what you did that night. The tactical decisions, the manual gunnery after the targeting systems failed, the way you repositioned a burning tank to shield 12 men in a command track who would have died without cover." He shook his head slowly, as if trying to reconcile the legend he had learned with the broken man standing before him. "You saved those men," Vern continued. "You killed 3 T-72s with manual targeting while your own vehicle was on fire. You called in the airstrike that stopped the flanking assault. The after-action review said your actions changed the outcome of the entire engagement, changed the outcome of the battle." Clement's voice, when it finally came, was barely audible. "I lost my crew." 3 words. Simple. Devastating. The summary of everything that had happened since that night. The reason he had walked away from commendations and promotions and a career that could have taken him anywhere. The reason he had eventually walked away from everything. Vern shook his head again. "War lost your crew," he said. "An enemy round lost your crew. You did everything humanly possible, and then you did the impossible on top of that." But Clement was not listening. His eyes had gone distant, focused on something none of them could see. The darkness of a tank interior lit by fire. The screams of men he had trained and led and loved like brothers. The weight of Pike's body as Clement tried to drag him toward the hatch. The moment when the secondary explosion started and the recovery team pulled Clement out by force, leaving 3 men behind in a steel coffin that was about to become their grave. "I was the commander," Clement said. "Their lives were my responsibility. I gave the orders that put us in that position. I was supposed to bring them home." His voice cracked on the last word. Home. The place Pike had talked about constantly, where a girl was waiting for him to work up the courage to call. The place Oakes had planned to return to, where he would open a machine shop and apply that meticulous attention to detail to civilian work. The place Suarez had dreamed of, where his grandmother would make tamales and his mother would cry with relief that her boy had come back safe. None of them made it home. Only Clement. And every day since, he had been trying to figure out why. Colleen lowered her phone slowly. Her face had changed, the professional detachment giving way to something more personal. She had known men like this, had watched them carry burdens that no amount of medals or commendations could lift, had seen what survivors' guilt could do when it was left to fester for decades without treatment or support. "How long?" she asked quietly. "How long have you been on the streets?" Clement blinked, the question pulling him partially back to the present. 15 years, he said, give or take. 15 years. The number landed like a weight. 15 years of sleeping under bridges and eating from soup kitchens and walking through cities full of people who looked right through him. 15 years of carrying 3 sets of initials on his wrist and 3 faces in his memory and a grief that never got lighter no matter how far he walked. Derek finally moved. He took a step forward, then another, his earlier hostility completely absent. His face showed something Clement had not seen directed at him in longer than he could remember. Shame. Not the shame of being caught in a lie, but the shame of a man realizing he had badly misjudged another human being. "I called you a thief," Derek said. "Accused you of stolen valor. Threatened to have you arrested for trespassing." He stopped a few feet from Clement, struggling to find words that felt adequate. "I did not know," Derek said. I am sorry. I did not know. Clement looked at him with eyes that held no anger, no resentment, nothing but the exhausted acceptance of a man who had stopped expecting anything from anyone a long time ago. You could not have known, Clement said. I look exactly like what you thought I was. A homeless man with nothing to offer. That is what I am now. What I was before does not change what I became. The words hung in the cold air of the shop, heavy with 30 years of grief and 15 years of wandering and a lifetime of believing that survival itself was a form of betrayal. The wind outside had picked up, howling against the walls of the shop like something alive and hungry. Inside, no one moved. The revelation of Clement's identity had frozen them all in place, each person processing what they had witnessed in their own way. Mitch stood near the tank with his arms hanging loose at his sides, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. 20 minutes ago, he had been mocking this man, telling him to find a shelter, laughing at the idea that a vagrant could know anything about armor. Now he could not meet Clement's eyes. Vern had not stopped staring at the tattoo on Clement's wrist. His lips moved silently, forming words that might have been a prayer or might have been the names of men he had never met but had learned about in classrooms and training exercises and the oral traditions that passed from one generation of soldiers to the next. Colleen broke the silence first. She had stopped recording, her phone now lowered to her side, but her mind was already working through possibilities. I know people, she said, veterans, organizations, support networks. The Armor Association has been wondering about you for decades. There are resources available, programs designed specifically for situations like this. Clement shook his head slowly. I do not need programs, he said. Do not need resources. Just needed to warm my hands. He began to roll his sleeve back down, covering the tattoo and the scars and the history written on his skin. The motion was deliberate, almost ceremonial, like closing a book he had not meant to open. Derek stepped forward again. Wait, he said. Just wait. You cannot just walk back out into that cold. Not after what we just learned. Not after what I said to you. Clement paused with his sleeve half lowered. His expression had not changed, that flat acceptance that seemed to be his default state, but something flickered behind his eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or confusion. He had grown so accustomed to being dismissed that kindness had become a foreign language. What would you have me do? Clement asked. Stay here and tell war stories. That is not who I am anymore. That man died in the desert 30 years ago. What is left is just the parts that kept walking. The words landed with physical weight. Vern wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand, not bothering to hide the tears that had begun to fall. The other mechanics shifted uncomfortably, young men confronted with a kind of pain they had no framework to understand. Colleen tried again. At least let me make some calls, she said. There are people who would want to know you are alive. People who served with you. Commanders who wondered what happened. Clement's jaw tightened. Commanders who gave me medals I did not deserve, he said. Who called me a hero when I was anything, but I sat in that hospital bed, and they pinned a silver star on my chest while my boys were being put in the ground. You wanted to call those people and tell them what? That I had been sleeping under bridges because I could not stand to look at my own reflection. The bitterness in his voice was startling, a crack in the passive facade that revealed something raw and wounded beneath. This was not a man at peace with his past. This was a man who had been at war with himself for 3 decades and was losing. Derek looked around his shop, at the tools and the vehicles and the space heater struggling against the cold. His father had built this place from nothing, had spent 40 years turning wrenches and teaching young mechanics and believing that hard work could solve any problem. Derek had inherited the building and the debt and the stubborn conviction that giving up was not an option. Stay tonight, Derek said. The word surprised him as much as anyone. There is a break room in the back. Couch, heat, coffee, food in the vending machine. It is not much, but it is warm and it is safe. Clement stared at him. Why, he asked. An hour ago you were threatening to call the police. Derek swallowed hard. Because an hour ago I was wrong, he said. Because my father raised me better than I acted tonight. Because you fixed something my mechanics could not figure out and then stood there and let us mock you instead of defending yourself. because I do not know what you have been through, but I know it deserves better than me sending you back into a blizzard." The word blizzard made everyone glance toward the windows. The wind had intensified, and snow had begun to fall in thick sheets that obscured the streetlights beyond the glass. What had been merely cold was becoming dangerous. Vern spoke up. "He is right," he said. "You're not walking anywhere in that. Stay. Rest. In the morning, we can figure out next steps. Or you can leave if that is what you want. But tonight you stay." Clement looked from face to face, reading intentions and measuring sincerity with eyes that had learned to trust nothing and no one. These men had mocked him, accused him, threatened him, and now they were offering shelter and food and something that looked almost like respect. He did not know how to process it. Kindness without conditions had become so foreign that it felt like a trap, like something that would be yanked away the moment he allowed himself to believe in it. But the wind was howling and the snow was falling, and his hands had only just stopped shaking from the cold. And somewhere beneath the layers of grief and guilt and self-imposed exile, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, accepting help was not the same as admitting defeat. Clement lowered his sleeve the rest of the way. His eyes found the M48 patent sitting in the center of the shop, that massive steel monument to a kind of warfare he understood in his bones. "One night," he said quietly. "Then I go." Derek nodded quickly, relief evident on his face. "One night," he agreed. "Whatever you need." But as Clement moved toward the break room in the back, Colleen was already reaching for her phone again. She had made a promise not to push, but she had not promised not to make calls. And she knew someone who needed to hear about this. Someone who had spent 30 years wondering what happened to a tank commander called Iron Horse. The break room was small and worn, with a sagging couch against one wall and a folding table surrounded by mismatched chairs. A coffee maker sat on the counter, next to a microwave with a cracked door, and a vending machine hummed in the corner, its fluorescent light casting a pale glow across the linoleum floor. It was not much, but to a man who had spent 15 years sleeping under bridges and in doorways and in the back corners of shelters, it looked like a palace. Clement stood in the doorway, hesitant to cross the threshold. Derek had given him a blanket from somewhere, a thick wool thing that smelled faintly of motor oil, and someone had put a sandwich and a cup of coffee on the table. Simple offerings, basic human kindness. And yet Clement found himself frozen, unable to accept what was being given. He did not deserve this. Did not deserve warmth or food or a place to sleep that was not wet with rain or snow. Pike and Oaks and Suarez were in the cold ground, had been there for 30 years, and here he was being offered comfort he had done nothing to earn. "You going to stand there all night, or are you going to sit down?" The voice came from behind him. Vern had followed him to the break room, carrying his own cup of coffee and wearing an expression that mixed concern with something harder to define. Not pity. Clement had learned to recognize pity and despise it in equal measure. This was something else. Understanding, maybe, or recognition. Clement moved into the room slowly, lowering himself onto the couch with the careful movements of a man whose joints had aged faster than his years. The cushions sank beneath him, soft in a way that felt foreign after so long on concrete and cardboard. Vern took a seat in one of the folding chairs, positioning himself where he could see Clement without crowding him. The two men sat in silence for a long moment, the only sounds the hum of the vending machine and the muffled howl of the wind outside. "I was 19 when I enlisted," Vern said finally. "Thought I was going to be a hero. Thought I would see combat and come home with medals and stories. Instead, I spent 4 years changing oil and rotating tires at bases in Germany. Never fired a shot in anger. Never saw anything worse than a training accident." He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes distant. "Used to feel ashamed of that," Vern continued. "Like I had not really served because I never went to war. Then I got out and started working here, and I met guys who had seen the real thing. Guys who came back different. Guys who would flinch at loud noises and could not sleep without the lights on and drank themselves to death, trying to forget things they could never forget." He looked at Clement directly now, holding his gaze. "I stopped feeling ashamed after that," Vern said. "Started feeling lucky. because I got to come home whole. And watching what combat did to the men who were not so lucky, I realized that the war does not end when you leave the battlefield. It follows you, lives inside you. And some men carry it better than others, but nobody carries it easy. Clement said nothing. His hands were wrapped around the coffee cup someone had given him, absorbing warmth he still was not sure he deserved. You have been carrying it alone for 30 years, Vern said. That is a long time to fight a war by yourself. Clement's voice came out rough, scraped raw by emotions he had spent decades suppressing. They trusted me, he said. Pike Oaks Suarez. They climbed into that tank because they believed I would bring them home. I was their commander. Their lives were in my hands. And I failed them. Vern shook his head slowly. You did not fail them, he said. The enemy failed them. The war failed them. A round from a T-72 that came out of nowhere in a sandstorm failed them. But you did not fail them. You did everything a commander could do, and then you did the impossible on top of that. Clement's jaw tightened. You were not there, he said. You did not hear them screaming. Did not feel Pike's blood on your hands while you tried to drag him out. Did not watch Oaks die because the fire reached him before you could. Did not have to leave Suarez behind because the ammunition was cooking off and the recovery team would not let you go back. His voice had risen, cracking on the words, 30 years of suppressed grief breaking through the walls he had built to contain it. I left them, Clement said. I was their commander, and I left them in that burning tank, and I walked away. Every day, since then, I have been trying to figure out how to live with that. And the answer is I cannot. So I stopped trying, stopped living, started just existing. Because existing does not require you to forgive yourself. Vern leaned forward in his chair. His eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. They would not want this for you, he said. Your boys. They would not want their commander sleeping under bridges and punishing himself for something that was not his fault. You do not know what they would want, Clement said. They are dead. They do not want anything anymore. The words hung in the air, brutal in their finality. Vern sat back, momentarily silenced by the depth of the pain he was witnessing. Out in the main shop, Colleen had stepped outside to make her call. The snow was falling harder now, accumulating on the ground in thick white drifts, but she barely noticed the cold. Her phone was pressed to her ear, and on the other end of the line, a man's voice had gone very quiet. Iron Horse, General Raymond Stokes said. You're telling me someone found Iron Horse? Yes, sir, Colleen said. He is here, at an auto repair shop in the city. He's been homeless for 15 years, living on the streets. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Stokes spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. I'll look for him, the general said. For years after he disappeared. We all did, the whole armor community. He was the best tank commander I ever served with. The best I ever saw. And he just vanished. Colleen glanced back toward the shop. He is broken, sir, she said, carrying 30 years of guilt for losing his crew. I do not think he believes he deserves help. Another pause. Then Stokes spoke with the quiet authority of a man who had commanded thousands. Give me the address, he said. I am coming tonight. An hour passed. The blizzard intensified outside, burying the city under a white shroud that muffled sound and light alike. Inside the shop, the mechanics had drifted into an uneasy vigil, finding small tasks to occupy their hands while their minds churned through what they had witnessed. Mitch had returned to the patent, working on secondary systems with a focus that bordered on obsessive. He had not spoken since the revelation, had not looked toward the break room where Clement rested. The shame sat heavy on his shoulders, visible in the hunch of his back and the way he flinched whenever someone addressed him directly. Derek moved between the front counter and the shop floor, checking his phone repeatedly for weather updates that only confirmed what he could see through the windows. The parade was still 4 days away. The tank was coming together, but none of that seemed to matter anymore. Not in the same way it had before an old man walked through his door and turned everything upside down. Colleen had come back inside after her call, snow melting in her hair, her expression carefully neutral. She had not told anyone about General Stokes, had not mentioned that help was coming whether Clement wanted it or not. Some things were better revealed than explained. In the break room, Clement had not moved from the couch. The sandwich sat untouched on the table, the coffee growing cold beside it. Vern had left him alone after their conversation, recognizing that some silences needed to be respected. But even alone, Clement could not find peace. The dreams would come tonight. They always did when he allowed himself to rest in a place that felt safe. The fire, the screaming, the faces of 3 young men who had trusted him with their lives and paid the ultimate price for that trust. He would wake gasping, reaching for a hatch that was not there, trying to pull bodies from a tank that had burned to nothing 30 years ago. Better to stay awake. Better to sit in the fluorescent glow of the vending machine and let exhaustion blur the edges of memory until morning came and he could walk back into the cold where he belonged. The sound of an engine cut through the wind outside. Not a car. Something heavier, more powerful. The kind of engine that belonged to a vehicle built for conditions exactly like this. Derek looked up from his phone. "Who the hell is driving in this weather?" he said. The headlights swept across the front windows, impossibly bright in the snowblind darkness. The engine died. A door slammed, and then the front door of the shop swung open, admitting a gust of frozen air and a man who carried himself like he expected the world to stand at attention. General Raymond Stokes was 74 years old, but age had done nothing to diminish the command presence he had cultivated over 4 decades of military service. His white hair was cropped short, his back ramrod straight despite the cold, and his eyes swept the shop with the automatic assessment of a man who had spent a lifetime evaluating tactical situations. He wore civilian clothes, a heavy coat over what looked like hastily pulled-in slacks, and a sweater, but everything about him screamed officer. Authority radiated from him like heat from a furnace, and every mechanic in the shop straightened unconsciously as his gaze passed over them. "Which one of you is Colleen Fraser?" Stokes asked. His voice was calm, but carried the expectation of immediate response. Colleen stepped forward. "That would be me, sir." Stokes nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement that somehow conveyed both gratitude and command. "Where is he?" he asked. Before Colleen could answer, Vern emerged from the back hallway. He had heard the commotion, had come to investigate, and now stood frozen in the doorway with his mouth slightly open. Even without insignia, even without uniform, he recognized what he was looking at. "General Stokes," Vern said. The name came out reverent, almost whispered. "You commanded the brigade at Medina Ridge." Stokes turned to face him. His expression softened slightly, the hard edges of command giving way to something more human. "I did," he said, "and one of my tank commanders is here. A man I have been looking for since 1993. Derek stepped forward, his earlier confidence completely absent. "Sir," he said, the word coming automatically. "He is in the break room. Back there." He agreed to stay the night because of the storm. Stokes nodded and began moving toward the hallway. The mechanics parted before him like water before a ship's prow, none of them willing to impede his progress. Colleen fell in behind him, and Vern followed after a moment's hesitation. At the door to the break room, Stokes paused. Through the small window, he could see a figure on the couch, hunched and still. The last time he had seen Clement Washburn, the man had been in a hospital bed, bandaged and broken, receiving a silver star he did not seem to want while 3 flag-draped coffins were loaded onto transport planes. 30 years. 30 years of wondering, of searching, of hoping that somewhere out there, the best tank commander he had ever known was finding some measure of peace. Now he knew the truth. And the truth was worse than anything he had imagined. Stokes pushed open the door. Clement looked up from the couch, his eyes taking a moment to focus on the figure in the doorway. Recognition came slowly, fighting through layers of exhaustion and disbelief. His face went pale. "General," Clement said. The word came out hoarse, barely audible. Stokes crossed the room in 3 strides. He did not speak, did not offer explanations or ask questions. He simply reached down, pulled Clement to his feet, and wrapped him in an embrace that 30 years of military bearing could not prevent. "I found you," Stokes said, his voice cracking. "God help me, I finally found you." And Clement, who had not allowed himself to be held by another human being in 15 years, stood rigid for a long moment. Then something broke inside him. The walls he had built, the distance he had maintained, the careful isolation that had kept him alive but never let him live. It all crumbled at once. His arms came up slowly, trembling, and he gripped the general like a drowning man grips a lifeline. They stood like that for a long time, two old soldiers holding each other in a break room that smelled of stale coffee and motor oil. The fluorescent light hummed overhead, indifferent to the magnitude of what was happening beneath it. Outside, the blizzard raged. Inside, something that had been frozen for 30 years was beginning to thaw. When Stokes finally pulled back, he kept his hands on Clement's shoulders, studying the face of a man he had once commanded with an intensity that bordered on grief. The years had not been kind. The weathering, the exhaustion, the deep lines carved by decades of guilt and exposure. This was not the tank commander Stokes remembered, the one who had stood straight and proud even while receiving medals he claimed not to deserve. This was what remained after 30 years of war against himself. Why, Stokes asked. His voice was quiet but demanded an answer. Why did you disappear? Why did you never reach out? We looked for you, Clement. The whole armor community looked for you. Your family looked for you. Clement flinched at the word family. He had a wife once, children, a house with a porch where he used to sit and watch the sunset and try to convince himself that the violence he had participated in had led to something good. They had tried to help him, had watched him spiral into nightmares and silence and a distance that grew wider every day. He left before they could see what he was becoming, before his children could grow up watching their father disappear piece by piece. A note on the kitchen table. For words. I am sorry. Goodbye. That was 15 years ago. He had not looked back. I did not deserve to be found, Clement said. The words came slowly, dragged up from somewhere deep. My boys died because of me. I was their commander. I was supposed to bring them home. Instead, I got a medal and they got graves. Stokes shook his head, a sharp motion that carried the authority of a general, even in civilian clothes. That is not what happened, he said. That is not what the after-action review found. That is not what anyone who was there that night believes. He guided Clement back to the couch, sitting beside him rather than across from him. The positioning was deliberate, two men facing the same direction rather than opposing each other. I read every report, Stokes said, interviewed every survivor, reviewed the helmet cam footage frame by frame. Do you know what I found? Clement said nothing. His hands had begun to tremble again, that fine vibration that came from somewhere deeper than cold. I found a commander who did everything right, Stokes continued, who positioned his tank exactly where doctrine said it should be, who reacted to an ambush faster than anyone had a right to expect. The round that killed your crew came from a T-72 that had been missed in the initial reconnaissance. It was firing from a position that should have been cleared 2 hours before your unit arrived. He leaned forward, his voice intense. That was not your failure, Stokes said. That was an intelligence failure, a reconnaissance failure, a failure of the units that were supposed to clear that sector before you rolled through. But you did not fail anyone. You took a hit that would have killed most crews instantly, and instead of dying, you fought back. You saved 12 men in that command track. You called in the airstrike that stopped the flanking assault. You changed the outcome of the entire engagement. Clement's jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on something none of them could see. You were not inside the tank, he said. You did not hear them. No, Stokes agreed. I was not. But I've spent 30 years reviewing what happened, and I am telling you as your commanding officer that you did not fail your crew. The war failed them. The enemy failed them. But their commander honored them with everything he did after that round hit. The words hung in the air, offered like a lifeline to a drowning man. Clement wanted to believe them, wanted to accept the absolution that Stokes was offering. But 30 years of guilt had built walls that one conversation could not breach. I left my family, Clement said, after I got out. I could not be what they needed. Could not look at my children without seeing Pike and Oaks and Suarez. Could not hold my wife without feeling like I was betraying men who would never hold anyone again. So I left, walked away from everything and everyone. That was not the war, General. That was me. Stokes was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its commanding edge. What remained was something softer, something human. I know about your family, Stokes said. I tracked them down years ago, hoping they might know where you were. Your wife passed away 8 years back. I'm sorry. Clement closed his eyes. Another loss. Another piece of the life he had abandoned, gone forever. But your children, Stokes continued. They are still looking for you. They never stopped. Your son is a teacher in Ohio. Your daughter works for a veterans organization in Virginia. She spent her weekends helping homeless vets find housing and services. She told me once that she does it because maybe somewhere out there, someone is helping her father. The sound that came from Clement was not quite a sob. It was something rawer, something that had been locked away for so long that it had forgotten how to emerge properly. His shoulders shook, and for the first time in 30 years, tears began to fall. They do not want an apology, Stokes said quietly. I spoke with them. They want their father back. Whatever pieces are left, whatever you have become, they want you back. He put a hand on Clement's shoulder, a gesture of connection and support. It is not too late, Stokes said. It is never too late. The news about his children broke something open inside Clement that he had sealed shut 15 years ago. His daughter spent her weekends helping homeless veterans. His son had become a teacher. They had built lives, good lives, and they had never stopped looking for the father who had walked away without explanation. He had told himself he was protecting them, had convinced himself that his absence was a gift, sparing them the burden of watching him deteriorate. But the truth was simpler and more selfish. He had been protecting himself, running from the pain of looking into faces that reminded him of everything he had lost and everything he had failed to be. Stokes let him cry, did not offer platitudes or try to rush him through the grief. Just sat beside him on that worn couch in that dingy break room while 30 years of suppressed emotion found its way to the surface. When the tears finally slowed, Clement spoke. His voice was wrecked, scraped raw, but there was something different in it, something that had not been there before. I do not know how to go back, he said. I do not know how to be a father to children who grew up without me. I do not know how to explain where I have been or why I left or what I have become. Stokes nodded slowly. You do not have to know, he said. You just have to be willing to try. The rest comes with time. From the doorway, Vern cleared his throat softly. He had been standing there for several minutes, unwilling to interrupt, but equally unwilling to leave. Behind him, Derek and Colleen waited in the hallway, their faces solemn. Sir, Vern said, addressing Stokes with the automatic deference of a man who had served. There is something you should see. Stokes glanced at Clement, a silent question. Clement wiped his face with the back of his hand, a gesture that seemed to cost him what remained of his pride, and nodded. Whatever it was, he was done hiding. They walked out into the main shop together. The mechanics had gathered in a loose semicircle around the M48 Patton, but they were not looking at the tank. They were looking at Mitch, who stood before them with his phone in his hand, and an expression that mixed shame with something that might have been hope. I made some calls, Mitch said. His voice was unsteady, nothing like the confident mockery he had wielded earlier. After what happened, after what we learned, I called some people I know in the veterans community, posted in some forums, asked if anyone remembered Iron Horse. He held up his phone, turning it so the screen faced Clement. It has been 2 hours, Mitch said. 2 hours, and there are already 300 responses. People sharing stories, posting pictures from the Gulf, talking about what you did at Medina Ridge and how it saved their lives or the lives of people they served with. Clement stared at the screen, unable to process what he was seeing. Names he did not recognize, sharing memories he did not know existed. Men who had been in that command track he shielded with his burning tank, writing about the moment they realized they were going to survive. Officers who had studied his engagement at training schools, describing how his actions had shaped their understanding of courage under fire. Mitch lowered the phone. His eyes were wet. I called you a liar, Mitch said. Mocked you. Told you to find shelter. And the whole time, you were someone who saved hundreds of lives with what you did that night. Someone who changed how the Army trains tank commanders. Someone who deserved better than anything I gave you. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. I am sorry, Mitch said. The words came out broken, but sincere. I am so sorry. Clement looked at the young mechanic who had treated him with such contempt just hours before. He should have felt anger, should have felt vindication at seeing his accuser humbled. But all he felt was tired. Tired of carrying grudges. Tired of keeping score. Tired of the weight that had pressed down on his shoulders for so long, he had forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. "You could not have known," Clement said. The same words he had offered Derek earlier, but they carried different weight now. "You saw what I showed you. That is all anyone sees." Vern stepped forward. "That is going to change," he said. His voice carried a conviction that filled the shop. "The Armor Association is already mobilizing. General Stokes being here, the post going viral. This is going to be news by morning. The whole country is going to know who you are." Clement shook his head slowly. "I do not want fame," he said. "Do not want attention. Do not want people treating me like something I am not." Stokes put a hand on his shoulder. "Then tell them what you do want," he said. "You have a voice now. People are listening. Use it." For a long moment, Clement was silent. He looked around the shop at the faces watching him. Mechanics who had mocked him and then been humbled. A young woman who had seen something in him worth investigating. An old soldier who had recognized a brother beneath the grime. A general who had never stopped searching. And beyond these walls, somewhere in Ohio and Virginia, two children who had never stopped hoping their father would come home. Clement straightened. It was a small motion, barely perceptible, but Vern saw it. The posture of a tank commander emerging from beneath the shuffle of a homeless man. "I want to help," Clement said. His voice was stronger now, clearer. "There are others like me. Veterans sleeping under bridges because they cannot forgive themselves for surviving. If my story means anything, I want it to mean that they do not have to carry it alone. That there's a way back. That it is not too late." He looked at Stokes. "You said my daughter helps homeless veterans," Clement said. "Maybe it is time I learned how to do the same." 3 months later, the shop had changed. A banner hung on the wall near the front counter, simple black letters on white canvas. "Veterans Welcome." Beneath it, a corkboard displayed photographs and thank you card for men and women who had found their way through the doors seeking more than automotive repair. Derek had partnered with the local VA to create an apprenticeship program for veterans transitioning back to civilian life. 3 former soldiers worked the floor now, learning to turn wrenches alongside Mitch and the other mechanics. The work was steady. The purpose was clear. And every Friday afternoon, the shop closed early for a gathering that had become something of a tradition. Clement stood near the M48 Patton, which had made it to the Veterans Day parade after all. He had ridden in the commander's hatch that day, wearing a fresh uniform provided by the Armor Association, saluting crowds who did not know they were watching a legend emerge from 30 years of shadow. The photographs from that day had gone viral, shared millions of times, accompanied by stories of what he had done at Medina Ridge and what he had survived in the decades since. But fame was not what had changed him. What had changed him was the phone call 3 days after that night in the shop, when a woman's voice on the other end of the line had said one word and then broken into tears. "Dad." His daughter had driven through the night to reach him. His son had flown in from Ohio the following morning. They had found him in a hotel room that General Stokes had arranged, sitting on a bed that felt too soft after 15 years of concrete, staring at his hands like he did not recognize them. The reunion had not been easy. There was anger beneath the relief, hurt that years of absence could not erase with a single embrace. His daughter had demanded to know why. His son had sat in silence for long stretches, processing a grief he had carried since childhood. But they had stayed, had listened, had refused to let him retreat back into the isolation that had nearly consumed him. Family, Clement had learned, was not something you earned. It was something you accepted. And accepting it meant accepting that you were worthy of love, even when you did not believe it yourself. Now he stood in the shop where everything had changed, watching young mechanics gather around while he explained systems that no manual covered. His hand still shook, probably always would, but they knew what they were doing, and the knowledge he carried had found purpose again. Vern approached with 2 cups of coffee, handing one to Clement without ceremony. The older mechanic had become something like a friend over the past months, a bridge between the world Clement had left and the one he was learning to inhabit. "Got another call today," Vern said. "Marine from the Gulf, living in his car outside the city. Someone told him about you. Asked if you would talk to him." Clement took the coffee, wrapping his hands around the warmth. "What did you tell him?" "Told him you would be here Friday," Vern said. "Same as always." told him the door is open. The door is open. That had become the unofficial motto of whatever this was. Not a program, not an organization, just a shop that closed early on Fridays so that veterans who had lost their way could find a place where someone understood, where no one asked for paperwork or demanded explanations, where a man who had slept under bridges for 15 years could look another broken soldier in the eye and say the words that mattered most. I was you. I lived under that same weight. But I'm still here. And if I can come back, so can you. Some listened. Some did not. Some came once and never returned. Others came back week after week, slowly emerging from the shells they had built around themselves. There was no magic formula, no instant healing, just presence, just patience, just the quiet understanding that the war does not end when you leave the battlefield, but neither does the brotherhood. The front door opened and Colleen walked in, shaking snow from her coat. She had become a regular presence as well, her connections in the veterans community proving invaluable as word spread about what was happening in this small shop in the industrial district. Behind her came two figures that made Clement's breath catch. His daughter Sarah, tall and serious with her mother's eyes. His son Michael, broader now than Clement remembered, with a teacher's patient demeanor. They came every Friday when they could. Sometimes they stayed for the whole gathering. Sometimes they just stopped by to see him, to remind themselves and him that he was real, that he was here, that he was not going to disappear again. Sarah crossed the shop and hugged him without words. Michael followed, clapping him on the shoulder with a grip that said everything language could not express. Clement held his daughter and looked over her shoulder at the tank sitting in the center of the bay. The M48 Patton, restored and preserved, a monument to a kind of warfare that felt distant now. He had spent 30 years running from what that machine represented, running from the fire and the screaming and the faces of 3 young men who had trusted him with their lives. He still talked to them, still whispered their names in the quiet hours before dawn, still carried their initials on his wrist and their memory in his heart. But the conversations had changed. Instead of apologies, he offered updates. Instead of guilt, he shared purpose. Still here, boys, he would tell them. Still trying. Helped 4 more vets find housing this month. Got a Marine coming in Friday who needs someone to listen. Your sister says hi, Pike. She's doing good. Strong like you always said she would be. The gathering began to form around him. Veterans finding seats, coffee being poured, the quiet murmur of men and women who understood each other without explanation. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you that the hands that seem useless might once have held the fate of nations, we hope you will subscribe to our channel. Every veteran you pass on the street has a story. Some of them might just be extraordinary. Let us know in the comments what this story meant to you, and who in your life deserves to have their hidden worth recognized. Thank you for watching. Clement raised his coffee cup to the room, a small gesture that carried the weight of everything he had learned. The door is open, he said. It always will be. Outside, the snow continued to fall. But inside the shop, surrounded by the smell of diesel and coffee and the quiet strength of people who refused to give up on each other, Clement Washburn had finally found his way home.